Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Welcome to the course Principle in Animal Life 2. This is the second part of lecture number 34. The topic is early development of Darwin's ideas of evolution. Discussing agenda for the topic is ideas from the origin of species. Descent with modification lecture outcome. After watching and listening this lecture, students will know about the early development of Darwin's ideas of evolution. Ideas from the origin of species. Darwin, in his book The Origin of Species, gathered evidence that descent with modification by natural selection explains three broad observations about nature. The unity of life means some traits are common between organisms. What is the basis for this feature? What is the basis for the rich diversity that is on exhibition around the globe? Why the organisms are so perfectly suited to the environment where they are found? In the first edition of The Origin of Species, Darwin never used the word evolution, although the final word of the book is evolved. Rather, he discussed descent with modification. We have already discussed that Darwin never used the word evolution, but he used this phrase to refer to this phenomena of change. Organisms share many characteristics, leading Darwin to perceive unity in life. Organisms share characteristics because of having a common ancestor, and the ancestor can be a recent common ancestor or a distant common ancestor. Now, the number of shared characters depends upon the last common ancestor. If it is a recent one, then more characteristics will be in common between two organisms. If the last common ancestor is a distant one, then few characteristics will be shared or common. He attributed the unity of life to the descent of all organisms from an ancestor that lived in the remote past. So he attributed the similarities between the organisms, the common features between the organisms, to the fact that the organisms descended from a common ancestor, therefore they are having some common features with each other. Now remember that at times the organisms have common features because of the fact that they live in the same environment. They are related with each other. After all living organisms do have a common ancestor. If you go back to 4 billion years, then all the living organisms that are existing today or used to live somewhere in the past do had one common ancestor. But then we talk about the recent common ancestor and the distant common ancestor. So sometimes the two organisms physically look like closely related to each other, yes, still they have a distant common ancestor. So what is the reason for that? That although the two organisms look like each other, as if they have a recent common ancestor, but they have a distant common ancestor. So the answer is convergent evolution. Convergent evolution is a process in which two organisms that are related to each other from evolutionary point of view, but through a very distant common ancestor, and these two organisms develop similar features because of living in the same environment. So do remember that two organisms have more common features either because of a recent common ancestor or because of living in a similar environment, or coevolution or convergent evolution. He also thought that as the descendants of that ancestral organism lived in various habitats, they gradually accumulated diverse modifications or adaptations that fit them to specific ways of life. So here basically he is pointing towards his finding of the 14 species of finches on the Galapagos Island. The ancestral stock, the ancestral species migrated from the mainland South American continent, and that ancestral species distributed to different parts of this Galapagos Island where they found different items to eat, and in this way their beaks are modified in different ways so that they can feed on different food items, and in this way they evolve into 14 different types of species. So these 14 different species do have similarities with each other because they evolved from the same ancestral stock, and they do have differences from each other because of living in different diverse environments or feeding on diverse food items. So Darwin reasoned that over a long period of time, descent with modification eventually led to the rich diversity of life we see today. So because of living in diverse environments, the changes accumulated in organisms, and this is the result of as a result, so many species are there on the planet Earth today. This is a sketch of from one of Darwin's notes. Darwin viewed the history of life as a tree with multiple branches from a common trunk out to the tips of the youngest twigs. So this is just like a tree, and these are the different branches of this tree, and these branches are divided into branchlets, and this is and you can assign it as a tree of life. Nowadays we call such a tree as a phylogenetic tree, which show evolutionary relationship between different groups of organisms. So it is a type of an evolutionary tree where different branches have emerged at regular intervals, and the point of branching shows a common ancestor. So in this diagram, the tips of the twigs that are labeled AD represent several groups of organisms living in the present day. So this group represent organisms that live nowadays, A and D. While the unlabeled branches represent groups that are extinct, these are the groups that have gone extinct. Each fork of the tree represents the most recent common ancestor of all the lines of evolution that subsequently branch from that point. So here is the most recent common ancestor of these three branches. Here is the most recent common ancestor of these branches. Here is the most recent common ancestor. So this branching point shows the most recent common ancestor. Now, for example, for B and D, the most recent common ancestor will be at this point because they are connected to each other at this point. Whereas for B and A, this is the point where they are connected with each other. Similarly, for D and A, this is the point where they are connected with each other. Now suppose if we write another number, E, if we write E here, E, then this will be the most recent common ancestor for B and E. So the point of branching is the recent common ancestor, where the species at the end of the branches have the recent common ancestor at the point of branching. Now here you can see the phylogenetic tree of the elephants, living species of elephant, the Asian elephant, and two species of African elephants. So this is the Asian elephant, and these are the two species of the African elephants, and this is the timeline in millions of years, and look at that. This is the branching point where the common ancestor is located. So the common ancestor of the Asian and the African elephant was there at that point. This is the point where both of them had a common ancestor, and then these two diverged into different lineages, and then this further diverged into two different species. So these closely related species are very similar because they share the same line of descent until a relatively recent split from their common ancestor. Now here you can see that the closer the common ancestor is, the more will be the similarities between the two individuals. So they have more similarities with each other because they have their common ancestor is a more recent one as compared to this one. They are slightly different than this one because their common ancestor was a bit farther. They have more differences with this one because here was their common ancestor, and they have even more differences with this one because their common ancestor was further distant in the past. Similarly, you go on Look at this, their common ancestor was around about 50-60 million years ago. So look at the differences between the two. And look at this one, their common ancestor is 60 million years ago. So look at this, the difference between these two. So the simple fact which is on exhibition here is that the more the common ancestor is recent, more will be the common features. The more distant the common ancestor, more will be the differences. Note that 7 lineages related to elephants have become extant over the past 32 million years. So in the past 32 million years, 7 lineages have become extinct. This one. As a result, there are no living species that filled the morphological gap between the elephants and their nearest relatives today, the hyrax and manatees. So the species which had more recent common ancestor has more shared features, and you can see that with the passage of time the change is occurring, modification is occurring. In other words, evolution is taking place. Artificial selection, natural selection, and adaptation. Now, artificial selection. Nowadays, the scientists, the plant breeders and the animal breeders, they cross different plants, different breeds. They prepare different breeds of animals, different breeds of plants. They cross plants with an intention that the offspring or the hybrid will have beneficial features of both parents. It is a kind of hit or miss method, cross best with the best and hope for the best. It's a breeding is a very patient, it's a process which requires lots of patience. Sometimes the process is successful, sometimes it's a complete failure. So Darwin proposed the mechanism of natural selection to explain the observable patterns of evolution. He crafted his arguments carefully, hoping to persuade even the most skeptical readers. First, he discussed familiar examples of selective breeding of domesticated plants and animals. So he discussed the process of artificial selection, where the humans are the breeders. The humans cross two animals or two plants which have favorable traits, and they have a goal to incorporate those favorable traits from either parent to the offsprings, and to prepare a smart and ideal hybrid pair offspring, a single individual which has the ideal characteristics of both parents. So the Darwin used this as an example that maybe a similar process is also taking place in nature, where the nature is selecting individuals which are having favorable traits, and the nature tends to increase the number of such individuals which have favorable traits. The nature tends to keep such favorable traits in population. As a result of artificial selection, crops, livestock, animals, and pets often bear little resemblance to their wild ancestors. Darwin then argued that a similar process occurs in nature. He based his arguments on two observations from which he drew two inferences. Members of a population often vary in their inherited traits. At that time, there was no knowledge of genes or alleles. Here basically what it means, if you analyze that observation one in light of the current knowledge, then we can say that different alleles exist for determining a trait, and these alleles determining this trait to varying degrees. Observation 2. All species can produce more offsprings than their environment can support, and many of these offsprings fail to survive and reproduce. Means the organisms have a remarkable ability to reproduce. Just look at the fishes or the amphibians. They produce large number of gametes, they lay large number of eggs, but all of them do not survive because the availability of the resources puts a limit on the number of individuals which eventually survive and reach the reproductive age. So what was the inference drawn from these observations? Individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offsprings than do other individuals. Inference 2. The unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits in population over generations. Means some individuals have favorable traits, others have unfavorable traits. So the organisms which have favorable traits are at an advantage, and they will be in a position to reproduce and leave more offsprings because of the traits they have. Darwin saw an important connection between natural selection and the capacity of organisms to overproduce. He began to make his connection after reading an essay by economist Thomas Malthus, who contended that much of human sufferings, disease, famine, and war resulted from human population's potential to increase faster than food, supplies, and other resources. Thomas Malthus wrote an essay on population, and in that essay he documented that the living organisms have remarkable abilities of reproduction, but they fail to reproduce at their potential because there are certain agents which limits their reproductive capabilities, and these are the diseases, famine, and war. Similarly, Darwin realized that the capacity to overproduce was characteristic of all species, means all the species have this innate ability to reproduce, to transfer their genes. Of the many eggs laid, young bones and seeds spread, only a tiny fraction complete their development and leave offsprings of their own. So only a small fraction of the eggs laid and of the young bones and of the seeds produced, they reach their reproductive age. The rest get destroyed. The rest are eaten, starved, diseased, unmated, or unable to tolerate physical conditions of the environment, such as salinity or temperature. An organism's heritable traits can influence not only its own performance, but also how well its offspring cope with environmental challenges. For example, an organism might have a trait that gives its offspring an advantage in escaping predators, obtaining food, or tolerating physical conditions. When such advantages increase the number of offspring that survive and reproduce, the traits that are favored will likely appear at a greater frequency in the next generation. So the organisms which have traits, which have characteristics that enables them to thrive well under the prevailing environmental conditions, such organisms will survive and they will reproduce, and these traits will propagate, and the organisms carrying such traits will increase in number in the population. Thus, over time, natural selection resulting from factors such as predator, lack of food, or adverse physical conditions can lead to an increase in the proportion of favorable traits in a population. How rapidly do such changes occur? Darwin reasoned that if artificial selection can bring about dramatic changes in a relatively short period of time, then natural selection would bring such changes over many hundreds of generations, means it's a slow and steady process. And these favorable traits will gradually accumulate in the population, and less favorable traits will diminish. Over time, this process will increase the frequency of individuals with favorable adaptations, hence increasing the degree to which organisms are well suited for life in their environments. So here you can see a manatee which is beautifully camouflaged in the background, and it is not visible to the predator. This is another example. They are beautifully camouflaged. So they are having traits which are helping them thrive in their environment. Suppose if they had any other type of phenotype, any other type of trait, any other type of characteristics, then they would have been easily visible to the predator. Then what would have been the eventual conclusion? These organisms having this type, different type of traits would have become diminished from the population. Suppose if it had a black coloration, then a black coloration on a green plant is easily visible to the predator. So then it would have been diminished extent from the population. Now it is having a trait which is increasing its ability to survive. Therefore, its number will increase in the population. This was the end of the lecture. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.